It off to you.
Good Friday morning, friends. We have a lot to discuss. As you know, many of you have been visiting with your members of Congress who have come back to the state this week, and there has been a lot going on. So, without further ado, we're going to start first with some of the coverage that many people like yourselves have been getting from across the state. You guys are doing a great job about keeping Medicaid in the news. And I wanted to kind of point out a few things that I saw across the state that really tease out some nuances and experience that are common to many of the people that we know in our community, but that may not be things that the press always thinks about. So this article, Senator Baldwin has continued to have Medicaid roundtables across the state, and some of those roundtables have gotten local media coverage. This article was particularly interesting because it talked to a couple of moms, and one of those moms really did a nice job of saying how Medicaid had touched her and her family in multiple ways across her life. So this is an experience that many of us have. And in her case, she has is a mother of a child who has a disability and is, in the getting the care that they need and being able to stay at home because of Medicaid. But she's also somebody who had her own mother use Medicaid temporarily in that case, because that is often a role of Medicaid is to support people when they are having a temporary time in their life, and then lots of times that support leads people to move off of Medicaid later as their situation changes. And she was able to talk about that as part of her experience, of her mother's experience, but what it meant to her and her family. And then also as a worker who works with many people who rely on Medicaid to get certain services. And I think this is, if you are a person that has those kind of stories, really talking about how Medicaid touches people for different reasons in different parts of their life is a good message for the press to have, especially because Medicaid pays for so much long-term care. And there are many older adults who may never think that they will ever need Medicaid and maybe didn't through their whole life. But boy, if you end up in a nursing home situation and after all of your money has been spent in private pay, you are going to end up on Medicaid too. So it's a really good way to kind of say this is something that touches people at different points in their lives in different ways. And lots of times people never thought they would be on Medicaid, but end up there, and sometimes they don't stay there, but sometimes it becomes a really important support. This was a really nice op-ed. And I will tell you that I know the reporter who published this op-ed, and he contacted me before he published it because he had a couple of questions about home and community-based services. And he said to me, "Oh my gosh, this is a really powerful op-ed." I mean, he was just so moved by the story. So just so you know, when you contact some of these reporters, you are in a process of developing a relationship that you can go back to, and that sometimes what you're saying does impact, their how they pay attention to issues and what they choose to continue coverage. And we've talked a lot over the months about, developing those relationships and going back and showing people different angles of this issue. So it's important to remember that like that is part of relationship building, is getting, helping reporters understand that this is a deep issue that deserves a lot of continued coverage. It isn't just a once in time story that you cover once and then it ends. Um, Another big piece this time in Racine, and this is another angle that hasn't been covered as much, but for those of you who work in county governments or perhaps with aging and disability resource centers, or perhaps are interacting with people who are getting services that are primarily county run, the idea of how does this impact, county governments and county services is an important one. Counties do a lot of work in Wisconsin with Medicaid. Um, they are the people running and operating the Children's Long-Term Care Support Program, and a lot of our mental health services are also county-based. They also have a big role in administering a lot of Medicaid benefits. So they're kind of the people who are, helping make sure that everybody who's in Medicaid is eligible to be there. And a lot of the money that we talk about as Medicaid dollars doesn't stay at the state. It actually goes to counties to support county workers and county jobs and local people who are receiving those services. ADRCs are another example. Many people, they might not know maybe our board or the state agency, but they do know their Aging and Disability Resource Center. And that's where many people go first for all sorts of things. And some ADRCs, 50% of their operating costs are actually covered by Medicaid because, again, they play a very large role in helping people understand their options, especially related to long-term care. So a lot of the folks that are walking through their door are really asking for options about how do I stay in my own home? What is the support that caregivers might be able to get to help support their family member? I'm ready for family care or Iris, or I think I may need nursing home facilities. Lots of people in counties have a big role in servicing the public. And people, who's walking through your doors if you're those folks. But there's another piece of this money comes down and impacts county budgets. And if it changes and not as much is there, what does that mean to counties? So this is an article that I think could be said 72 different ways. That's how many counties we have in Wisconsin. And it's been an aspect of this bill that hasn't been covered so much. The Medicaid Coalition had an event this past week that really focused on mental health, because Medicaid is the primary payer for mental health services in the country. And so this event kind of focused on a specific population of people and what does it mean to those providers and people who need mental health services if there's less Medicaid money. A successful event. There was some coverage that got out of it. But for those of you who are local businesses who maybe serve a variety of clients who are using Medicaid, this is a good example of, okay, how do we show a specific impact on a specific kind of person who is using Medicaid, and what would it mean if those dollars were different? There was a recent coverage of Senator Ron Johnson came back to the state and did a number of events. And one of our Wisconsin moms got a call. She had the opportunity to ask a question of this reporter, and he called her right away and said, "Hey, can we come and do an interview in 15 minutes?" And so she had, cleaning her house because her house is probably like mine, and sat down in about 15 minutes and did an interview that got some video coverage in the Milwaukee area. And I think it was a good message. They spent more time covering what Senator Johnson was saying, and what he was saying is he wanted deeper cuts to Medicaid. But she became almost the counterpoint to a U.S. state senator. So again, nice example of sometimes those connections that you know become really important. And sometimes reaching out to somebody that you don't know very well, but saying, hey, this is my question, results in something big, like a story where you're the person who is questioning whether, um, the comments of a U.S. senator. Just so folks know, last week, the reconciliation bill passed the House, and we talked about that last week, and we talked about reacting to that passage. These are the lists of organizations that I found on our kind of nerd press, political press, the Wheeler Report. These are all organizations that put out a statement last week in reaction and response to the reconciliation bill. You can see that a lot of them are disability oriented or cross disability oriented. Some touch aging kids. Kids Forward is here, and that they represent a lot of children and families. So a pretty big list. If I missed your group, it's only because I didn't find it in Wheeler. And if you send it to local places or you send it later, let us know. You guys are always very good about letting me know if I missed you. But just so you know, there were a lot of people, a lot of organizations that said, yep, this idea is not a good one for us. So there are a number of grassroots folks who are thinking about how do we have a discussion with a broader group of people about Medicaid. We're grounded in this. We know what's happening, but we don't think everybody in our communities knows what's happening. I'm going to share a slide with you, spoiler, that they're right. Their feeling is right. And there's actually been some survey work that shows just how many people in your communities are totally unaware that any Medicaid cuts are included in the reconciliation bill. So this is an idea that's kind of been bubbling for the last few weeks, and it's finally going live. And the idea is to kind of have watch parties in various public places of this particular documentary. It was just aired on public television, and it really is about the advancement of what led up to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I think is going to be 35 years old this year. So I think it's a really good idea. And they have a Facebook group called Hands Off Medicaid. And they are broken up by congressional districts. So if you know who your member of the House is, if you're in District 1 or 2 or 3, there's a page for you, and they are going to be posting details for local watch parties there. And if you think this is a good idea that maybe, you'd like to host at your local library or other public space, or that you think would be useful, for your clients, if you're a provider, to hold kind of an event, or for a disability or other group that you belong to, like Rotary Club, whatever, they have a toolkit that they've developed, and there's an email address on here. So if you want to do this event and replicate it, you can do that and contact them, and they'll send you the stuff. There's also an event on June 12th. It's virtual. That is a discussion about this documentary. So kind of think of this as a two-part event. One is in public and in person, where people are kind of viewing this. It's almost like a book club, right? So there's a public viewing that's kind of sort of like a book club, except nobody has to read anything. And then this virtual event is really a panel discussion about the documentary. And I think that's a kind of cool, like, two-part thing that that people can do. This isn't necessarily only about Medicaid, but I think the idea is to help folks understand how integral Medicaid has been and is for people with disabilities, as a way that they are better able to achieve basic rights, like living in the community. And you can save the date. This is hopefully the first of two events. This is an in-person event. Lots of unpaid caregivers are potentially impacted by Medicaid cuts as well. And so again, the Medicaid Coalition is going to be hosting at least one, but probably two events in different parts of the state to talk about what is the impact of Medicaid cuts on unpaid caregivers specifically. So stay tuned for that, but you can mark this date in your calendar. All right, let's get to Congress. There's a couple things going on. You'll see that rescission bill is back on this slide. We haven't talked about that in some weeks. It's back. But we're going to focus most of our time on continuing to understand what's in this reconciliation bill and what the U.S. Senate is going to do next. So let's get grounded. Everything in the bill that passed is a choice. This is a choice about whether or not to reduce revenue, right? Cutting taxes is decreasing the amount of money that's coming into the government that we can spend on other things. There are also some increases in spending in this bill. We are choosing what things we want to increase funding for. And in this case, it's Homeland Security, Justice Department spending, and defense spending. If you are making choices to reduce revenue or cut taxes, a lot of this bill is about which taxes are changing and by how much. And those choices are also about who will benefit from those tax changes and who won't. These are also choices about what spending cuts to make to pay for those tax changes. And the choices that you make on what you want to cut, you're also choosing who is going to be most impacted by those cuts. You also are seeing choices about how deeply to cut federal spending and how deeply to reduce tax revenue. Everything in this 1,082-page bill is a choice, okay? And if I had to boil down what the bill actually does, it's this. The bill cuts more than $1 trillion from Medicaid and SNAP and the Affordable Care Act marketplaces, which we'll talk about today as well. Just $1 trillion in Medicaid and SNAP, and that covers about $1 trillion in reduced tax revenue. That is kind of the top line. Here's what this bill does in 2 sentences. So let's talk about who benefits from those tax cuts, all of the revenue that will no longer come into the federal government for spending. The Penn Wharton does a budget model, and a lot of folks in Congress pay attention to it pretty seriously. And they did an analysis of the reconciliation bill as the House has passed it. That analysis includes effects of, both the tax cuts, but also, the Medicaid and SNAP cuts that are used to pay for them. Several weeks ago, we talked about, whether or not people who might get a tax cut would end up being better off with the reductions in benefits and the expiration of ACA marketplace exchanges. I didn't want to repeat that here, but that idea of, yes, if you're paying less in taxes, does that cover the amount that you might also lose in Medicaid or SNAP benefits or, increased cost to your ACA marketplace premiums? And for a lot of people, the balance of those two things may be no. And this analysis is showing that relationship. I put in a big purple line just so you can kind of see, the income level gap here. The big picture is the lowest earners lose and the highest earners win. and that people who make the least, if you make less than $17,000 per year, or you're reporting less than $17,000 a year for tax purposes, you start losing in money pretty quickly, about $1,000 beginning in 2026. And of course, this bill applies for across 10 years. So what you lose in 2026 continues to increase over that time. People who make between 17,000 and 51,000 lose about $700 on average in after-tax income beginning in 2026, and then of course that continues to deepen over time. You can look through the table and see, how much you have to earn and what benefit, what percent change you get. And keep in the back of the mind, some of those people who earn above $51,000, they still may end up not being better off, especially if they have an ACA marketplace plan and the cost of their premiums goes up, which we've talked about before. So like you can kind of eyeball this and go, okay, where am I in the income scale here? And what would it mean for me if I had this amount of income? What am I losing when we cut different services to pay for that? The top 0.1%, which are people with incomes more than $4.3 million, gain the most. They gain almost $400,000 after tax income per year. Those are probably the people who are least reliant on programs like Medicaid and SNAP, which require poverty as a eligibility criteria. So, the basic top line here is if you have a low income, you are more likely to be in the programs that have received that the bill cuts the most. All right, so what is that in Wisconsin? We have about 5.89 million people in the state. That's according to the census. And the census calculates what household incomes are. I think the top line here is that you can see there's an awful lot of people in Wisconsin who make less than $50,000. And those are probably the people who will lose income because of the tax cuts and are more likely to be reliant on SNAP and Medicaid that is used to pay for those tax cuts. And then the second biggest group of people in Wisconsin are folks that maybe make 50 to 99,000. So, the benefit for them is a little more like you have to look at your own situation to know, are you actually getting more back from not paying those taxes, or are you losing more in services that are valuable to you? Interestingly, the median income for non-family households, that's people living alone or two or more non-related people living together, that income for that group of folks is about 45,000. So if you fall into that category, you are more likely to be in the population of people that will be more impacted by the benefit cuts than the reduction in taxes. All right, so we've now outlined those are the big picture choices that the reconciliation bill the House passed has made. So where are we in terms of this bill advancing to the next process? I have a little "we are here" thing in there. Next week, Congress returns to Washington, D.C., and we should expect that we will then see this bill start to advance through this month. A couple of important points. The Senate is not planning at this point to do public markup meetings. The House did. If you remember, a few weeks ago, we spent a lot of time looking at public hearings that the Agriculture and the Energy and Commerce Committee did. That was kind of a great reveal of what are the actual ideas that the committee was considering about cutting Medicaid, and it turns out cutting SNAP. Spent a lot of time on that. And the Senate isn't planning to do that, which means we know what the House bill is doing. We know what the Senate is editing, but we aren't going to publicly see what edits they're considering. Negotiations are already happening now, and they're happening behind closed doors. There is an important thing the Senate does that the House does not. The Senate has a specific person called the parliamentarian, and the Senate runs by different rules. One of the rules that it uses to determine whether or not something can stay in the reconciliation bill is called the Byrd Rule. And it's named after a former senator. And that is what the parliamentarian is assessing now. She's looking through the House passed bill and seeing if there are individual provisions that don't pass muster. The Byrd Rule essentially makes sure that the content of the bill does relate to spending, first of all, and it isn't just a policy change. Some of you who follow our state budget process, it's kind of similar to when the Joint Finance Committee removes items for the state budget that they say, this doesn't have a fiscal impact. This is a policy item that you have tucked in here that we don't think belongs in the budget. And that's kind of similar to what the Senate is looking at now. So they're looking through the whole bill, and many Democratic senators, you can challenge provisions as saying, hey, this doesn't pass the Byrd bill or Byrd bath rule. There's all sorts of kind of funny phrases, like people are, we're going to look at the bill and give it a bird bath. And then bird droppings are things that come out of the bill. If you hear those things, just know that they're insider terms that are kind of quirky. But that's a big piece of work because this is a big bill. And there certainly are provisions that are already being identified. One of them, for example, whether or not states can be prohibited from regulating an artificial intelligence, that's in the House bill. And a lot of people are saying, I don't think that's going to be taken out. So this is important in the sense that anything that is in the House bill that is removed becomes something that the Senate isn't going to consider, and it's out of the bill. And if there are cuts that have been proposed that really don't look like they are going to say, there's no fiscal to them, there's changes that maybe affect Medicaid or people who receive Medicaid funding. If you get it out, taken out at this time, it's a big deal because it means it can't come back in. Once the parliamentarian kind of does that assessment, and they think that that might happen not next week, but maybe the week after, then the bill is ready to kind of be scheduled. And a lot of our national advocates are saying that all of these negotiations behind the scenes may happen in the next couple of weeks. And then, how they change the bill will be to amend it on the floor. So after the parliamentarian says, here are the things that have to be taken out, then the Senate really can schedule the bill for 20 hours of debate. And usually in that debate, there are lots of amendments. They call it a votorama, which always makes me think of The Simpsons for some reason, to make changes. And then once that 20 hours of debate is done, the full Senate can vote on the text of the bill. And remember, since it is reconciliation, you only need 50 votes in the Senate as opposed to 60 in order to pass it. There are a couple of recesses in here. Lots of coverage about what is the actual timeline to get this through the Senate leader is saying we want to get this done by July 4th pretty consistently. There are people who say that they may want to push that earlier. And certainly, if you have negotiations happening in the next couple of weeks and your parliamentarian is done with their work, then you would be in a position perhaps 2 to 3 weeks from now to schedule that debate and move something forward. The reason why the July 4th date keeps coming up is this bill does include a increase to the debt ceiling, which means basically raising, the United States government has bills that it has to pay. And if you don't pay your bills, that's a really bad thing. Congress has never not paid its bills, but it has included a kind of procedure where they have to agree to raise the amount of debt that they have in order to keep paying those bills. That debt ceiling date could be July or August. And one of the reasons folks say, well, maybe this will move a little faster in the Senate is because first, we don't know exactly when that X date is. But secondly, the House, because the Senate is intending to make changes, will need to come back and vote again to agree to the language that the Senate has changed. So we actually have a tremendous amount of stuff left. There's a lot of time to influence here in the next few weeks because the House barely passed this bill. They passed it by one vote, and many of the House members were really wanted certain things in this bill. And then the Senate may not keep them. So we could end up with a situation where what the Senate does, what the House passed might look pretty different. And that would be good for our interests. Okay. So our national policy folks are identifying several things that could really make the Senate version of the bill and the House version of the bill look very different. And several of these things are in the Medicaid and the SNAP section. A number of states are concerned about the new requirement for states to have to pay a match in order to draw down federal food assistance. Now, it's unclear if they're concerned about states having to pay that match at all, because currently states don't pay anything. SNAP is 100% federally funded, or if they're more concerned about the provision that would increase the amount of match that states have to provide based on their error rate of overpayments in the program. So again, that's an example of it's an issue that we think is really impactful to states and to people, but the solution, the amendment to how to address the concerns senators have may not fully address the state or our concerns about what that change could mean. A lot of some senators are concerned about Medicaid provider taxes. That change impacts Wisconsin less than many other states because we do not use provider taxes as much as other states do to generate revenue that then is used for the state portion of the Medicaid match. But, Wisconsin would like to use that maybe more than it does now. So for us, it becomes closing a door on potentially increasing revenue for Medicaid in the future. It is impactful, but there's a lot of states that really use that mechanism a lot. And so not being able to adjust that tax in the future would really limit their ability to raise revenue for their programs because they are more reliant on it as a source for their state match. So that was an area where I think you could see perhaps some differences and changes. And there might be a lot of ways to approach that policy that could impact Wisconsin more than the current provision in the bill. the bill, we haven't talked a lot about this, but the bill would defund Planned Parenthood. Essentially, they don't name Planned Parenthood by name, but nonprofit organization that does, a whole range of services. In a lot of states, Planned Parenthood is actually the only place where some services are offered on reproductive health. And so there are a couple of senators who, especially who represent rural areas, that this is the only place that people can go for a whole lot of different kinds of health care. And there's some indication that this may fall into one of those, yeah, this is more policy than it is about saving money, and it may not pass the Byrd rule. And if it doesn't pass the Byrd rule, then it's just removed from the bill, which, resolves the problem. The fourth one really is only about states that have expanded Medicaid, and we're not one of those, but it is a piece of, where there are some senators who have a different opinion on that. And then this, the prove you're working or exempt from working requirements, that is a big impact on Wisconsin. And you can see that there are some senators who have some some specific concerns about that provision. Two things to note. There are a couple of senators who don't like the idea of making all states do work requirements, like they would rather make states, have states have the choice to implement work requirements. And I think a lot of states might choose not to do that because administratively it's a lot of work and it's expensive. But I don't know how hopeful we should be on that because this is the biggest line item in terms of cost savings that the House bill has. Like, I think there's about $287 billion that the Congressional Budget Office expected, from that change. So if you start making changes to the items that are the larger cuts, you either have to figure out different ways to do other cuts or maybe make additional cuts. Or you have to scale back the amount of tax revenue reductions that you're expecting. So stay tuned on that one. But there are several states that have a lot of people who are seasonal workers. We have this too in our state, where there are people who maybe have an income that's above the Medicaid threshold for part of the year, but then it drops because the work drops. So if you start checking, every single month, you may have a lot of people who qualify one month and then don't qualify another month and then qualify the next month. It's called Medicaid churn. And that adds to the administrative work and paperwork headaches for everyone, including the person who's trying to figure out whether they have health and long-term care coverage. And there are also senators who are, had a different idea about what the working age would be. The House really puts it from 18 all the way up to when somebody turns 65. So 64 and 364 days would still be within working age under the House bill. And a lot of senators are saying, well, we thought you meant 18 to 50 or 18 to 55. And again, that's a big change. The more people the work requirement applies to, then the more savings you potentially can get from people losing their coverage. And there are senators who are keying in on the idea that, hey, wait a minute, if somebody loses Medicaid coverage, maybe we shouldn't make it more expensive for them to get marketplace coverage. That doesn't seem to make sense. But there are a lot of provisions in the prove you're working and exempt requirements that aren't on this list, including having to prove them before you were allowed to be in Medicaid, exemption, clarifications, all sorts of things. There are other web issues that aren't about Medicaid or SNAP, including making some taxes, mostly business taxes, permanent, There are some taxes that the House really wanted to include that aren't a priority for the Senate. And vice versa, there are some taxes that the Senate likes a lot more than the House did. There is certainly a contingent of senators who is really interested in deeper spending cuts. That they don't think the House bill that cuts 1.5 trillion is enough. And certainly Senator Thune, who's the Senate leader, has already said we are planning to cut 2 trillion, which is 500 billion more than the House cuts. So we should be expecting that there will be some changes to cuts and that they will be deeper. But there are certainly senators, and Senator Johnson has been very public about this, who want much deeper spending cuts than what either the House has passed or than what Senator Thune is publicly saying at 2 trillion. Senator Johnson has been quoted saying he'd prefer $6 trillion in cuts and going back to pre-pandemic spending levels. And my math is not great, but there's a big difference between 2 trillion and 6 trillion. And you know, if we are worried about the scale of cuts in the House bill now, that's significantly more. There are also senators who want to add more tax things that would reduce revenue. So a lot of flux in here of how do you balance all of these competing interests. So let's talk about the goal for the next few weeks. Obviously, the biggest goal is to prevent the bill from passing the Senate. And you can see that there's a lot of work that you and others have been doing to point out what is going to be impactful to states and real people across the country in the House bill that wouldn't help people. And Medicaid cuts and to a lesser degree SNAP are the two things that are getting the most attention. Good job, that's all on you. This bill needs 50 votes to pass. It needs a simple majority. The Senate has 100 members, and they need 50 of them to agree to whatever this bill ends up being. So that there's 53 Republicans, I think. They can only afford to lose 3 votes, and then before they can't pass the bill. Remember, the House only passed it by 1 vote. So it isn't a huge number of people that that need to have enough concerns. And even if they aren't willing to vote no on the whole thing, people who have Republican members who have a lot of concerns really do have a lot of ability and power to leverage those concerns into a delay of the whole bill and also, you know, to make the changes that they want to see in that bill. So you can kind of see there's a push and a pull between wanting to move fast and also members who have concerns, and some of those members want to cut more, right? Having some ability to leverage their support for the bill for items that they want to see added or taken out or done differently. If we don't get to goal 1, there's another goal. And we did this goal during the House reconciliation. The more delay you have, the better it is, because that means that there's a lot more time for the Senate to understand what's in the House bill and how those changes will impact their states. And maybe they will have more concerns about some of those items in the House bill as they learn more. We'll talk a little bit about what Wisconsin has already done, and I'm expecting that we will see our Department of Health Services starting to release some analysis of what these different Medicaid provisions that are in the House passed bill would mean for the state. They already did that with the SNAP provisions, and I think they're really helpful. And the third goal, and I think this is a really important one, the more different the Senate version of this bill is from the House version, the better it is. Here's why. The House barely passed this. And they certainly have members who wanted to see much bigger cuts, right? The House bill, as much as we think it is impactful, that was a more moderated version of what the original ideas to cut Medicaid were in February. And that's all your victory. That is everybody working together for months to say the most different and radical ideas on cuts to Medicaid were not the ones that ended up in the final product of the House bill. That isn't to say that what is in this bill isn't very serious and impactful, but it's not as bad as it could be. But that's where they ended up. That is what could barely pass the House by one vote. So if the Senate version is very, very different, that means you now have to get all of those House members who barely agreed on something to now agree to something else that probably makes changes that some of the House members don't like. Whether it is taking out some tax cuts that they really value, like the state and local taxes, or making deeper cuts to Medicaid that might really upset some more moderate conservatives who have districts that have a lot of people in Medicaid, or you have changes that are appealing to some of the more fiscal conservatives who want to see deeper cuts. Well, those deeper cuts may also not be very popular with other members of the Republican caucus. And so that's when we're saying wedge issues. The more different these two bills it is, the harder it is to agree on the same language. And that is what they absolutely have to do. The Senate and the House must agree to the same identical language before that bill can be fully passed and sent to the president, to where he can determine whether he wants to sign it into law again, or not. So we have spent a lot of time talking about the Senate. Let's not forget our House friends. It's important. We've talked about how important it is to engage with lawmakers kind of continually, and you all have one member of the House of Representatives and two senators. And so when this bill was in the House, we were talking about making sure that your senators knew your opinion as well, because we knew that the Senate was going to end up having to consider whatever the House passed. Well, now the shoe is on the other foot. And two things. First of all, how your House member voted. In Wisconsin, all of the Republican House members voted yes on this bill. They voted yes on the version of the bill that the House is now considering that has more than $1 trillion in cuts for SNAP and Medicaid to pay for about $1 trillion in reduced tax revenue. They said yes to that. And all the parts of the bill that make changes. Those members are going to have to vote yes again on whatever the Senate sends back. So continue to make sure that they know how they voted and what you think about that vote and your concerns about the bill that they passed, and that they will have to come back when the Senate sends it back and vote again. And maybe they should consider, more of your concerns before committing to a yes vote. It's important that members know there are folks who are closely following all of the different changes that are happening in these bills, and that they know what the next step in the process is for them. A fourth thing, all of the Democratic members of the House, and we have two of them in our state, all voted no on this bill. They voted against what the House reconciliation bill has in it. And if you're feeling a little down, or that you've been making a lot of calls, or you need an easy call to make before you make a harder call, you can say thank you. And again, let them know that you're continuing to watch what the Senate is doing on Medicaid and SNAP, And you'll continue to be engaged and providing them with feedback as a constituent about what you think about those changes that this Senate bill makes, especially to those programs. All right, so you've seen this slide before. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, except to say, here is kind of the big picture summary of the Medicaid cuts that impact Wisconsin the most. There are more cuts in the reconciliation bill that are directed at states that have expanded Medicaid to people between 100 and 138% of the poverty line. If states expanded Medicaid through the Affordable Care Act. We did not do that. So some of the items that are in the reconciliation bill aren't as applicable to us for that reason. These are the things that we think are going to be the most impactful for our state. One other thing, the work requirements piece is probably the biggest financial and paperwork burden impact on not only our Department of Health Services, but our state budget and every individual who ends up being touched by those new requirements to either prove that they're working or that they're exempt. There was a nice New York Times article that kind of summarized what those work requirements will, in effect, end up meaning for people who have to do them. There was also an opinion piece that was published from Trump administration officials that was really quite insightful. Last week, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, Secretary Kennedy, as well as the leader of the Centers for Medicaid Services, Dr. Oz, and the Secretary of both the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Housing and Urban Development all came up with an opinion piece that they co-authored that basically said, we want universal work requirements for able-bodied adults across all welfare programs, Medicaid, SNAP, housing vouchers. Now, the reconciliation bill doesn't include work requirements on housing vouchers, I don't think. But it does change existing work requirements for SNAP, and it would implement first work requirements for Medicaid. Remember, we also have a president's budget that's supposed to be coming out. We haven't got it yet. So it's interesting to see that the head of the Department of Housing and Urban Affairs is making these comments, because it might give us a clue that we should expect other public benefit programs to end up with similar kinds of requirements. And for many with disabilities and low-income older adults, they may be in and rely on multiple programs, including Medicaid, SNAP, and housing vouchers. So you can see that if you add paperwork requirements for each one, there is a increasingly complex mass of bureaucratic red tape that people have to navigate on some sort of routine basis. And even if you're not subject to, to proving you're working, if you believe you are going to fall into an exempt category, you still have to prove that you're exempt and have the documentation to do that. This is important because it kind of says that the folks that are affiliated with the Trump administration are publicly giving the nod to the US Senate to say, we really want this change that is in the House bill. Don't make big changes to the work requirements. Make maybe some little changes that address your needs, okay? This is not a well-written bill. This week, it took, I think, about 3 or 4 attorneys. We had a small question on one provision of the bill, and it actually was a large question, because it's like, well, if we're right, this would be really impactful. And we don't know if we're right because we're reading the language and we can't figure it out. So we asked some other people. And pretty soon we had an email that had like 5 people on it, and a couple of them were attorneys. And it took us a lot of time to untangle and go, I think this maybe doesn't apply to Wisconsin. But it could, but it doesn't look like it applies. That is just one example of there is a lot of language in this bill that was hastily written, not particularly clear, maybe needs a lot of interpretation. Some parts seem to contradict other parts in other sections, and we should be prepared that we're going to have more things that we discover are in this bill, as well as a lot more analysis of what do these different things actually end up meaning for states. I'm going to cover 2 things that we learned about this week. One about changes that would impact ACA marketplace plans, and then another group of things that would make it much less appealing for non-expansion states like Wisconsin to expand Medicaid to cover more people. So in previous webinars, a long time ago, we have talked about the Affordable Care Act marketplaces. Many people who don't have employer-sponsored insurance, or who were, people who are self-employed, actually get their insurance independently through the ACA marketplace. There are many people with disabilities who actually get part of their insurance or are fully insured through ACA marketplace plans. That is also true for many older adults. It is also true that there are a lot of small business provider agencies, especially in the home and community-based world, who don't have more than 50 employees, or maybe they have a lot of employees, but most of those employees are part-time. They're not full-time. And therefore, those small businesses fall under the threshold of having to provide employer-sponsored insurance, and their employees end up getting health care coverage through the ACA marketplace. That's certainly been something we've heard about in especially home health and personal care agencies, that many of them are small, don't have the number of employees, and they aren't able to, they aren't required to provide employer-sponsored insurance, or they are frankly just priced out of the market to provide that insurance, and so they send their employees to the marketplace for coverage. There's a lot of changes in this bill that are specific to the ACA marketplace, and when you look at all of them as a whole, it really looks like they are returning the marketplace to the early years when this law was first passed, when the marketplace didn't work as well. Sometimes when you pass a big piece of legislation like the Affordable Care Act, it takes a little bit of time to kind of work out the kinks. And that has been what's happened in the last 15 years. That you may remember there was a rocky start. Their website crashed, for example, when it was launched. And they figured out, as they were implementing, some of the tweaks that needed to be made to make the program run smoother. These changes seem to roll back a lot of those things that were learned, and make it harder again for individuals who are trying to get marketplace coverage to do that successfully. So many of these items really look like policy changes, and they're hard to understand and to kind of parse out into a talking point, but collectively, they really matter a lot, because it really does change how people can get coverage. For example, ending automatic re-enrollment. That means that you, the person who's got the insurance, has the responsibility again to actively seek out and enroll yourself every year. It's another paperwork requirement. Shortening how long you have to do that enrollment is another way of, making people have a high pressure deadline to do a thing that they don't have to think about right now. Lots of people have changes in their life, death in the family, a divorce, who knows, where they may have or they lost their employer sponsored insurance for whatever reason. Um, oh, the current law has, like, there's a 90-day grace period where people can remain covered and get the financial assistance to help pay for that coverage while they're getting their paperwork in the order. This bill would end that. And that's impactful if you're the person who has to navigate a bunch of complicated changes in real time and may end up not being covered for part of that time. There's also some shifts back to the old model of increasing out-of-pocket limits, allowing policies that have higher copays and deductibles to be sold. The focus of anti-fraud is no longer on insurance companies, it's on individuals. And the Trump administration, outside of the reconciliation bill, has already cut the amount of funding for the workers who help people go through this process and get into the marketplace coverage. The marketplace navigator funding has been reduced by 90%. Those are the people who process all of the paperwork agreement requirements that this bill would increase. Okay. All of these changes in the reconciliation bill are independent of some of what we've talked about, which is talking about how the subsidies that are currently keeping premiums low for individuals will expire at the end of the year. And that will lead to pretty dramatic increases in premiums for folks if Congress doesn't act. The reconciliation bill does nothing to change that sunset. So at this point, we have administratively, the administration has cut funding for the groups that help people the most to navigate into marketplace plans. The reconciliation bill itself makes a bunch of changes that make it harder for people to get or stay in marketplace plans. And if Congress does nothing, which is likely, those subsidies expire to make those plans much more expensive for individual people, kind of across the board. All of that is to say that there will be maybe some healthy people, more likely healthy people, who aren't going to go through all of those hoops or won't be able to afford the plans, who decide to take a risk and be uninsured. And that's important because that is the exact problem that Obamacare was trying to resolve. It was trying to get as many people insured so that when they did show up to a hospital, there was a payer other than the individual who would cover part of that care. And the reason I'm saying healthy people might take the risk is you and I all know lots of people who, even if these things become very hard, will have to figure it out because the value of the care is too important to them. If you're already sick, or you have a chronic condition, or you are likely just by virtue of age or advancing disability to need care in the future, you do what you need to do to keep your insurance. Those are the people who are likely to have more expensive care needs. As soon as younger or healthier people start saying, I can't figure this out or it's too expensive, and they make a choice to stay uninsured and remove themselves from the pool, the insurance gets more expensive for everyone, because that is ultimately how you keep costs down. Is you need a big group of people, and you need a lot of people who don't need as much care, who are overall healthier, who are providing the funding to cover the folks who need care at the time. So it's, we spent a lot of time talking about this, but it's important in the sense that these are changes that ultimately have a larger impact on the healthcare system, just as the Medicaid cuts have a huge impact on the overall healthcare system because it's a major payer source that hospitals and other care places rely on in order to keep funded and operating. Another set of things that's in this bill that we haven't spent as much time on, and that some of these changes just were added in the last week, does look like there is some intention to make sure that it is more unappealing for states who haven't expanded Medicaid to do that. So it used to be that if a non-expansion state like Wisconsin decided to take the plunge and expand, that there was a bonus, an increase of 5% that the federal government kicked in as for the first few years while a state kind of ramped up and implemented its expansion. It makes sense because you've got some extra work to do on the front end, and you're getting additional federal money in to do that work. This bill takes that away. So now you don't get anything extra if you choose to expand. The other thing it does is it bursts a certain kind of reimbursement rate for inpatient hospital and nursing facilities, 110% for non-expansion states. So they give you a little boost on this one reimbursement rate, which, by the way, is still not enough to cover actual costs. But there's another clause that says, if you choose to expand, we're going to take away that extra 10%. And that could be the difference between a state thinking about, does it make more economic sense for us to cover more people under Medicaid or not? If you now have to calculate, I'm not getting any bonus payment, and I'm going to lose this 10% for this high cost service, then the amount of funding that the state gains goes down. In addition to all of the other provisions in the bill that already apply to expansion states. So if you become an expansion state, you are actively deciding that you are going to have to comply with many things that are in the reconciliation bill that currently expansion states don't have to do. And that includes some things that are administratively expensive for states to take on. So collectively, again, this is another kind of cluster of policies that make it less likely that states like Wisconsin will expand. There's been some increased coverage also about how do Medicaid cuts affect family caregivers. It's something that we've been thinking about. The Medicaid Coalition is going to have a couple of events on the specific issue. But there are lots of people that are unpaid caregivers who are in Medicaid. There was a PBS story that was talking with one of the experts in this field that said there are 4 million family caregivers who rely on Medicaid for their own health coverage. So a lot of these changes, prove you're working, prove you're exempt, they will apply to that set of caregivers in some fashion. And there are an awful lot of caregivers who provide the navigation support for people who are in Medicaid to stay on the program. And that is potentially a couple of very high administrative burdens that are going to be, again, shifted to caregivers if people, want to keep their care in Medicaid. And we've talked a lot about how, if you create budget holes to states and they have to make decisions about what to cut, we're really concerned that home and community-based services, which are optional, might be first on the list because they are expensive. Well, right now, unpaid caregivers are really the backbone of home and community-based services. In some ways, unpaid caregivers are providing a tremendous amount of the care that occurs. Some estimates are up to 80% of the actual care is not paid for by the system. It's paid, it's taken care of by unpaid caregivers. If you reduce the strength or the support of that system, it does shift, again, more work onto unpaid caregivers. And some people aren't able to do that work, which could mean that you end up with more people ending up not being able to stay in their own homes because their unpaid caregivers simply cannot take on all of the things the state is shifting to them. Another revelation this week, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and many low-income older adults may be in both Medicaid and Medicare. They're called dual eligibles, and about 20% of Medicare beneficiaries are also in Medicaid. Medicare beneficiaries are about 30% of Medicaid spending. And you don't need to know how all of it works to know that if you have cuts to Medicaid spending and people lose their Medicaid coverage, or Medicaid coverage covers less, or, then that has an impact on Medicaid. We have about 100, or Medicare, sorry. We have about 176,000 people in Wisconsin that are in that situation where they're low income and they're on both Medicare and Medicaid, and they kind of have, like, Medicare pays for some things and Medicaid kind of supplements and pays for the things that Medicare doesn't pay for. Well, if you start tinkering and reducing the value of the benefit for Medicaid, or people lose their Medicaid benefits, then all of a sudden you have an impact on really Medicare and obviously the individual involved. Another revelation late last week, we've talked a lot about deficits. So the reconciliation bill that the House passed dramatically reduces the amount of revenue that's coming in. And while it makes big cuts, it doesn't make enough cuts to offset or make up for the revenue it's deciding not to collect. That's called deficit spending, where you are reducing the amount of money that you are taking in, but you're still spending. Your cuts are not making up that difference. And it's a pretty big deficit. And it would increase the deficit by at least $2.3 trillion. There's a law that Congress passed some years ago called the PAYGO law, pay as you go, that says, hey, if you're passing a bill that increases the deficit too much, we're going to put in a penalty. If you're going to increase the deficit and you're not going to think about offsetting that lack of revenue, that deficit spending, with spending cuts that are going to essentially make the spending zero, right? Reduce here, we get zero. We're going to make you do mandatory cuts. You're not going to get if you're deciding that if you don't want to decide what cuts to make, and you do a bill that has too much deficit spending, then we're going to do across the board mandatory cuts. And there's a word for this. It's called sequestration. Sequestration does apply to Medicare. And what sequestration would mean is that it would be an automatic 4% cut to most Medicare spending, which is a $500 billion reduction in Medicare if this bill, as it's passed, remains the same. Sequestration also applies to all other federal discretionary programs. It basically says we are going to do a mandatory across the board cut, and then identifies all of the places that happens. So you can see that some of the places that have already gotten spending cuts or been reduced by the administration, there would be more. Things that are already have appropriations and are funded in 2025. If you let sequestration happen, then all of those places get shaved off the top. And the House bill basically would, if it goes in the form it is now, would mean there'd be across the board $230 billion in sequestration cuts over the next 10 years, every year for the next 10 years, to essentially make up for the lack of, not making enough spending cuts. In the past, Congress has always chosen to stop these automatic cuts. I mean, the PAYGO law is not a particularly great way to reduce spending. It just says whatever, we're going to make across the board cuts. So it's actually never been implemented. However, we have a different Congress this year, and you have to do something different than what the House bill does now in order to not have this problem. Perhaps the Senate will make changes where the deficit spending on the bill will change and it won't trigger sequestration. Perhaps there may be members who say, you know what, I don't want to make specific choices, so sequestration seems like an easy and good idea. Who knows? But as it stands now, Medicare would also be impacted if nothing changes in that House bill with that level of cuts. And I think for a lot of us, the overall impact on the healthcare system now is becoming more clear because there's a lot of people who move from one form of coverage to another, and sometimes fairly quickly. People are always moving from Medicaid to the ACA marketplace, from the marketplace down to Medicaid, from Medicaid to employer and sponsored insurance, employer and sponsored insurance to the marketplace or Medicaid. Some people have Medicare and Medicaid. All of these people are kind of flowing through multiple doors to access healthcare. But adding complexity and paperwork to every single entry point really does increase the risks that there will be people who either end up with gaps in coverage or can't manage to get in or stay in any of these pathways. And if you're a hospital who's trying to figure out, or other provider, who's trying to figure out, okay, what is my source of payments? Medicaid is a big one. Making sure people have some sort of insurance, either through the marketplace or employer sponsored. Medicare, these are all the big sources of money that keep health and long-term care services open and operating. And it looks like this bill is going to impact really all of them and perhaps lead to a lot more people being uninsured. Just the changes in Medicare or Medicaid and the marketplace alone are projected to result in 14 million people losing their insurance. SNAP cuts. We're moving on. These are the items that we think Wisconsin would be infected by the most. And there are now starting to be some analysis of specific provisions. There was a national analysis from the Congressional Budget Office that just looked at the work requirement and said, yep, that's going to save $92 billion in federal spending by forcing 3.2 million people off of their food benefits. Okay, that's one provision. Our friends at the Department of Health Services did their own analysis because there are really several items in that list of SNAP cuts that significantly add costs for states. And what they found is, hey, the changes in the House bill mean that we have an extra $314 million a year that we would have to come up for funding for in order to run the program in the way that the federal House bill would want us to. And if we did those changes, we think 90,000 people in Wisconsin would lose their food assistance benefits. When you think about $314 million a year, we have a 2-year budget cycle. 314 plus 314 is $628 million in a hole from this cluster of changes alone. And then think about the Medicaid cuts, which we haven't gotten an analysis for yet from the state, but would be equally or more impactful. And when you start thinking about what do these federal spending cuts mean for actual state budgets, a $628 million hole is a big one. And then you're increasing it. No state can cover that kind of loss of revenue without really rethinking what it is spending its money on. Very quickly, because we cover some of the other things that are happening besides the budget. The Government Accountability Office is called the GAO, and they often do, they're kind of similar in this to the Congressional Budget Office, but they're independent. They often do analysis. Sometimes at the request of members of the Congress, they issue reports. They'll be issuing a report on work requirements that we talked about in September. And one of their focuses is on fraud, waste, and abuse, and just how do we make the things that government does work better. But it seems like there are some opinions that the GAO has had that haven't been popular with members of Congress who have, made cuts or stopped funding. So I think it's an important pin to put in here that some of these independent analyses that we rely on to help us understand how various changes are going to impact people and states are under attack, because what they are saying is they are not saying the things that the majority party would like them to say. And this week, Wednesday, remember rescissions? That bill that is supposed to, codify some of the cuts that DOJ has already made. Apparently, it's coming back and maybe on the House floor next week. So there's no legislative language that's been publicly released. It is unlikely that the bill will cover all of the cuts that have already happened in federal agencies, but certainly the press is covering that it will cover cuts to USAID, which is foreign aid, as well as proposed cuts to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds PBS and NPR. And as soon as that bill is introduced, Congress has 45 days to act on the bill. This rescissions bill is really about clawing back and taking back money that has already been appropriated. So this is entirely separate from the reconciliation bill, and it does require a 60 votes in the Senate. But we've been waiting for it for several weeks, and it has not come. And apparently next week we will know what's in it. All right, so this is the most important thing I'm going to say today, that you have all been really engaged on this issue, some of you since January, 4 months, and you have been talking and contacting your representatives and talking with the press. Tremendous amount of work, and you're doing great. But not everyone is paying any attention to any of this stuff, in actually a quite significant number. This graph is from our friends at the Data for Progress, and it was a survey done last week. And when they asked the question, basic question of, does this reconciliation bill include cuts to Medicaid? Almost a third of people didn't know. And 17% said the incorrect answer, which is no, they didn't think there were cuts. That's a huge group of people that are not as aware as you are about what is in this bill and why it matters to people like you and others across the state. Same was true with SNAP, even more true. And they specifically asked a question about, do you know whether this bill might result in cuts to services for people with disabilities, because people kind of care about that. And you can see that an even wider group of people didn't realize that this bill might impact people with disabilities at all. So I want you to see this as an opportunity, because it's a huge deal to see that there are that many people who perhaps, if they knew if somebody they know said what was happening in their concerns, might go, oh, I didn't know that. I don't think I like that. And it enables you to really feel empowered to be a teacher, right? Folks are much more likely to become engaged if someone they know tells them what is happening in Medicaid or SNAP cuts and what it could mean to them, their family, people they know in their family, to their small business, to the clients they serve. It really is a good sign that there are this many people who perhaps could be persuaded to say, I know this bill cuts Medicaid and SNAP, and I do not like those cuts, and perhaps I do not want to support those cuts. Very good sign. And as we go through the Senate process, it's really important that we get more and more voices engaged and being vocal about these issues, because it adds to the pressure and it adds to the knowledge that people have. One of the most important things from now until eternity, but from now until this, till beyond when whatever comes out of this process happens, is people like you being able to draw a straight line between cause and effect. These cuts are happening here. This is what they will mean. You are going to be the most influential folks, because many people are not getting their news from the same places or getting any news at all, and you may be their source of information. Good news, you're a credible source, so you may as well leverage it. Every connection is an opportunity at this point. One of my coworkers was in a meeting yesterday, and she said, I had 5 of my family members, and I just started talking about, if she is in a job that is fully federally funded, about being worried about the security of her job with all of these cuts. And they all know what she does, but they hadn't made any connection that, oh, you mean the funding for your job could be at risk? And it was like a light bulb, right? So we should never assume that the people around us, even if they know us well, know what the implication of some of these changes and actions that the administration or Congress is making has on people that they know. And it doesn't need to be a political conversation. It's a statement of facts, right? Like, I rely on Medicaid. I'm worried about these changes. Or if my food assistance goes down from $90 to $70, I'm worried about what that means for me. This is why I'm worried, because this bill contains those cuts. That isn't political. That's simply stating what is in a past piece of legislation. Some folks are starting to get responses back from their members of Congress. And I posted this one because this is coming from one of Wisconsin's Republican delegation members. And some of the things in this response are really, really familiar, because they've been things we've been hearing for months. And sometimes you can repeat untrue things many, many times. And if not enough people actually repeat the true thing, the untrue thing becomes heard as the truth. And I think that when we talked last week about, taking a red line and editing, it may be more and more important to do that, because we're looking at some of the responses and they look a lot alike. Like, it's almost like there's a set of talking points that has been given out, and that many of the responses that constituents are getting are similar. And there's a lot of things in here that are either misleading or flatly not true. But it's going to take constituents, saying that these things are not true and calling it into question, to kind of make sure that representatives know that these are not statements that are flying. Few slides, we don't have to go through them really in detail, but I put the text in orange that is from that constituent letter, and we're just going to draw a through line, right? The CBO found 4.8 million able-bodied adults who are choosing not to work. Let's talk about asking some questions. Where's that specific analysis? Because I haven't seen it. And I've been reading a lot of the congressional budget analysis, and probably some of you have too. Where's the citation? Every time I say something, I'm asked for a citation. Why should that be different from a member of Congress? Let's prove the words that you're saying. Show me exactly what you're referring to, and let's assess whether or not you're interpreting that correctly, because that may not be the case. There's some subjective language in here. How do you know whether somebody's choosing not to work? Did you ask all 4.8 million people in that group that you have identified as able-bodied adults, whether they're choosing not to work, deciding that they don't have to? Because that isn't who we understand is in Medicaid, and that represents the non-working population. In fact, there's only 8% of people in Medicaid who are not working, and most of those folks aren't working for really good reasons, like they're already sick, or they're caring for minor children, or they have a condition that is serious enough to qualify for disability benefits. It's time to start challenging those folks. And you see on this slide, this arrow, it's like taking you from the statement to showing them that you're not buying what's true. And there's fact sheets for it. If you are so inclined to want to prove what you're saying, even though many of our members do not feel the need to do that, you can feel pretty solid about saying these things, because folks from Kaiser Health News have also said it. Another example, and we've talked about this one really since February. No, there aren't illegal immigrants receiving Medicaid. Here's a through line to that and a fact sheet. Here's another piece on illegal immigrants. Some of the things that our Wisconsin delegation is saying are not even applicable to Wisconsin. And I think it is important to point that out, because their job is to represent this state. And that implies that they should know what this state is and isn't doing. Another example, 1.2 million people ineligible to receive Medicaid? Well, not in Wisconsin. So where is the responsibility for people who represent Wisconsin to say, to recognize the good job Wisconsin's already doing? And lastly, the idea that simply making states pay more money, when you are asking states to pay more money, you're reducing the federal funding to states. That creates budget holes. That makes states make hard decisions about cutting programs, including Medicaid. And if you were interested in correcting mistakes that you think are happening, just reducing money is not actually a strategy. That is going to result in lost coverage and less care. It is likely not to result in fewer mistakes or the corrections that perhaps policymakers might want to see. So just some examples for you to think about: how do you draw that line from what you see in a letter to the point of being a concise response that says, nope, that's not right. And we talked about last time, making sure that you're sending those letters to the press, that you're making a video. You may as well use humor at this point, because like some of the things that are being repeated are kind of almost funny if they weren't so serious. So make a video with your letter. Roll your eyes a little bit. Send it to your press, post it on the social media. If you're inclined, send it back to the lawmaker who gave you the letter with corrections. None of those things are going to hurt, but they will probably help. Again, in that idea of, we are in a space where there's an awful lot of people yet who do not understand these cuts. They do not understand what they mean, and they may be getting information that is only the content of those letters, which are not correct or are misleading. And you can be an important part of kind of making sure that folks are getting some information that is outside of their bubble. So last thing for today, all these things are public now. They've passed the House. This is real. Nobody can tell you, don't worry your head about this, because nothing will happen. They're on paper. A lot of people don't know what's on that paper. and they don't know what those changes could mean for people, and they don't know that we're kind of halfway through a process. The Senate still has to go. So there's a lot of influence that we can have if you know that you need to have that influence. And they're not going to know probably unless you tell them. Because while there is tremendous coverage, I mean, this community has taken Medicaid and SNAP, but Medicaid from being an issue nobody was talking about to if you throw a stone, you're going to hit a fact sheet or a major media article or independent journalist who is covering it, right? Like the amount of coverage by any traditional sense is immense. It is huge. It is much greater than it was in 2017. But not all people see those sources as credible anymore, and many of them aren't reading any of them. So you are kind of a person who can filter out the noise and make it very tangible and real. And they're not going to know unless you tell them because they're probably not seeing the same things or reading the same things or hearing the same things that you are. And with that, I'm going to stop. And I'm sorry, I'm a little late. Sally, are there any questions that we haven't gotten to?